Lindenstraße 47 in München was no different from hundreds of other typical five-story buildings constructed in the 1970s. An ordinary house in a residential district, faded plaster, neatly trimmed bushes at the entrance, bicycles on metal stands. The place where people live side by side for decades without knowing their neighbors. Erika Zimmermann moved into apartment number 21 in 2018. The affordable apartment with an acceptable layout fully corresponded to her modest budget as an elementary school teacher. The only inconvenience was strange sounds that sometimes could be heard from the neighboring apartment. I heard it for the first time in November 2018, about 2 months after my move, Erika recounts. It was something between crying and moaning. At first, I thought it was a television at high volume. The sound was muffled, as if through a wall. Her neighbor was Gerhard Schubert, a 64-year-old retiree who had worked for a long time as a technical supervisor in the same building. A small man with a well-groomed grey beard and an attentive gaze. He rarely left his apartment, and during encounters he limited himself to a reserved nod. I spoke to him once about the noise, Erika continues. He apologized very politely and explained that due to hearing problems, he had to turn the television louder. He promised to buy headphones. After that, it actually became quieter for a while. On January 15th, 2019, Erika heard sounds again. This time they were clearer, a woman's voice asking for help. Disturbed, she rang her neighbor's doorbell. Gerhard did not open immediately, appeared irritated and out of breath. He said he was watching a thriller, Erika remembers. There was indeed a television running in the apartment. I felt stupid and apologized for the disturbance. But something about his behavior made me suspicious. He stood as if he didn't want me to look inside, and he smelled of something strange, like in a hospital. But she noticed that footstep sounds from his apartment were often heard at night. It was as if he didn't sleep, walked back and forth for hours. For an older man, he was surprisingly active at night. In April 2019, notices about the disappearance of 27-year-old Anna Hoff appeared in the stairwell. The girl had come to München for a job interview and had not returned to her hostel. The police questioned the building's residents, since the last signal from her mobile phone had been located in this area. The officer showed me a photo, says Erika, a pretty blonde with short hair. I had never seen her. They asked if anyone had noticed suspicious persons in the area. Of course, nobody had seen anything. In such houses, nobody sees anything. A week after Anna Hoff's disappearance, Erika woke up in the middle of the night from a loud scream. The sound was so clear that she thought someone was screaming on the street. When she looked out the window, she saw no one. The sound repeated, and this time she recognized that it was coming from Schubert's apartment. I called the police, she recounts. 2 officers came quite quickly. They knocked on the neighbor's door, but nobody opened. After several attempts, Gerhard finally came out, looked sleepy, wore pajamas and a bathrobe. He claimed to have been sleeping soundly and to have heard nothing. The policeman checked Schubert's apartment, a standard procedure for such calls. A quick search revealed nothing suspicious. His 2-room apartment looked orderly, though modestly furnished, no signs of another person's presence. The officer told me that I had probably heard a cat or sounds from another apartment, Erika remembers. Theoretically, that was possible. The acoustics in old houses can be deceptive, but I was certain that the scream came from my neighbor. After this incident, the relationship between the neighbors became tense. Gerhard avoided encounters with Erika, and when he met her, he looked with poorly concealed anger. At some point, Erika began to fear that her suspicions were unfounded and that she was turning into a paranoid neighbor. In summer 2019, the Anna Hoff case gradually disappeared from news broadcasts. The girl was still not found, but the active search was discontinued. Her case became one of many unsolved missing person reports in the Munich police files, In August, problems with the water supply began in the building. The residents of the lower floors complained about weak pressure. The management company promised to send a plumber. For several months, nothing changed. On October 10th, 2019, a new resident moved into apartment number 23, one floor above Schubert's apartment. Claudia Meyer, a 32-year-old nurse, a bright, sociable woman who quickly became acquainted with everyone in the stairwell. Claudia was the complete opposite of the local atmosphere, Erika smiles. She brought homemade pastries to the neighbors, organized a WhatsApp group for the building's residents. She even managed to get Gerhard talking. They sometimes chatted in the stairwell. It was Claudia who first noticed the strange layout of Schubert's apartment. When she once helped him carry heavy shopping bags, she entered his apartment and was surprised by the size of the living space. She said to me, "Don't you find it strange that his apartment only has 2 rooms?" Erika remembers. "According to the building's floor plan, there should be 3 there, like in yours. Where did the 3rd room disappear to?" This conversation made Erika think. She lived in a 3-room apartment opposite Schubert's apartment. According to the logic of standard construction, the layout should be mirror image. But in the neighbor's apartment, she had only seen a living room and a bedroom. "I began to remember that night when the police came," she says. "The officers had actually only inspected 2 rooms and the kitchen, but there should have been another one. Perhaps they simply didn't pay attention to it." In November 2019, Claudia reported to the neighbors that she often heard strange sounds from the ventilation shaft in her bathroom. "It sounds like knocking or scratching," she described, as if someone were trying to attract attention. Erika and Claudia decided to speak with other residents. It turned out that many had noticed strange things. Martin Wagner from apartment number 19 told them that he had seen Schubert several times carrying heavy bags outside at night. Ingrid Bauer from the 1st floor remembered that in 2018, shortly before Erika's arrival, a girl had also disappeared in the building. A 25-year-old student who had rented apartment number 15. At the time, everyone assumed that she had simply moved away without notifying the landlord. "Of course, we discussed everything in whispers, like conspirators," Erika admits. Nobody wanted to openly accuse the neighbor. What if these are just coincidences? An elderly person can have strange habits. Perhaps the 3rd room was simply converted into a storage room. In December 2019, problems with the water supply worsened. The management company finally sent a plumber, Markus Weber. He checked all the pipes in the building and discovered an unauthorized connection to the main water line. "Someone made a branch directly from the main line," he explained to the administrator. "Professionally done, with a separate meter. But this is not recorded in the documentation." The branch leads toward apartments 17 and 19. Apartment number 17 belonged to Gerhard Schubert. The administrator, Dieter Kraus, decided to conduct an inspection. On December 15, 2019, he visited the retiree's apartment together with construction engineer Thomas Hoffmann. Schubert let them in reluctantly and explained the illegal connection as an old system left over from his time as caretaker. Hoffmann, who inspected the rooms, noticed the strange floor plan. "There should be another room here," he remarked, pointing to a wall in the living room. "According to the project, this is a 3-room apartment." Schubert explained that the 3rd room had been converted into a storage room where he kept tools and old things. The keys to it had allegedly been lost. The door was stuck, and he had not had access to it for a long time. "That sounded strange," says Kraus. "How can one not have access to part of one's own apartment?" I suggested calling a locksmith to open the door. Gerhard firmly refused and said he would solve this problem himself. The engineer nevertheless examined the wall where the door to the 3rd room should be located. He found no signs of a door. The wall looked solid, recently covered with new wallpaper. Either the room was completely sealed off, or it never existed. Hoffmann concluded. But according to the documents, there's clearly a 3-room apartment here. Where did a room with an area of about 15 square meters disappear to? After the administrator's visit, Schubert became even more reclusive. The neighbors rarely saw him. Even for trips to the supermarket, he chose early morning, when nobody was in the stairwell. In January 2020, Claudia Meyer filed an official report with the police. She reported suspicious sounds from the ventilation and the strange floor plan of the neighboring apartment. Considering the unsolved cases of missing women in the area, she requested that Schubert be investigated. Detective Jürgen Meyer took the report, but said openly that the police could do little without concrete evidence. We cannot search a person's apartment just because the floor plan seems strange, he explained. But I promise to investigate the cases of missing women and check if there is a connection to this address. The detective actually began the verification. He examined all cases of disappeared women in the area over the last 5 years. There were 7 such cases. 2 of the missing were later found. 1 had gone to relatives. The other was being treated in a psychiatric clinic. 5 women were never found. I noticed something interesting, Meyer recounts. The last signals from the mobile phones of 3 missing women were located within a 500-meter radius of Lindenstraße 47. This could not be a coincidence. The detective decided to check Gerhard Schubert's past. In the official biography, there was nothing unusual. Born 1955 in Dresden, moved to West Germany in the 1980s, worked as a technical specialist, then as a caretaker on Lindenstraße. No criminal record or offenses. However, a deeper check revealed gaps. Between 1982 and 1985, Schubert seemed to disappear from all documents. No data about residence, work, tax payments. In 1985, he suddenly appears in München and takes a position as a caretaker. That was suspicious, says Meyer. In those years before German reunification, such gaps in biography often meant imprisonment or stay in a psychiatric clinic. I made an inquiry to colleagues in Dresden to check the GDR archives. February 2020 was marked by a new development. The management company, disturbed by the discrepancies in the floor plan, requested historical documentation for the building. In the original plans, an interesting detail was discovered. Next to apartment number 17, there was a technical room with an area of about 10 square meters. In the current plans, this room did not exist. We suspected that Schubert, exploiting his position as caretaker, might have illegally connected the technical room to his apartment, explains Kraus. This would also explain the illegal connection to the water line. Hoffmann examined the technical floor of the house again and found that the room indicated in the old plans was indeed missing. In its place was a bare wall that had been recently painted. This already looked like a serious violation of building codes, says the engineer. We decided to involve the housing supervision and proceed officially. On February 20th, 2020, a commission consisting of representatives from the management company, housing supervision, and the building engineer arrived with an reporting official order for inspection at Schubert's apartment. When the retiree saw the official documents, he flew into a rage. He screamed that he was being persecuted, that the neighbors had conspired against him. At one point, he tried to throw the commission out. Housing Supervision Inspector Greta Schulz called the police to maintain order. While they waited for the patrol to arrive, Schubert calmed down somewhat and demanded that the inspection be conducted in the presence of his lawyer. They promised him to postpone the check until the next day. During the night, Erika heard noise from the neighboring apartment again. It sounded like moving furniture, hammer blows, she remembers. I called Claudia. She heard the noise too. We decided to call the police again. 2 officers arrived after 15 minutes. They knocked on Schubert's door, but no one opened. After several attempts, the police decided that the situation was not urgent and left, but promised to return in the morning. On the morning of February 21st, the commission arrived with 2 police officers at the appointed time. Schubert's apartment was empty. The bed was untouched. There was fresh food in the refrigerator. Everything looked as if the owner had just stepped out briefly and would return soon. His car, an old VW Golf, was missing from its usual parking spot. We decided to conduct the inspection without the owner, says Schultz. We had an official order, and his absence we considered as an attempt to obstruct the check. The commission carefully examined the entire apartment, trying to find the entrance to the alleged third room or technical space. They knocked on walls and measured distances. In the bedroom, we discovered something strange, Hoffman recounts. The built-in sliding wardrobe was suspiciously deep. The dimensions did not match the floor plan. We decided to check its back wall. When the engineer and one of the police officers pushed aside the clothing and knocked on the back wall of the closet, the sound proved to be hollow. Upon closer examination, they discovered that part of the wall was a camouflage door with well-hidden hinges. The police officer carefully opened the door. Behind it was a narrow passage, leading to a dark room. The officer switched on his flashlight and stepped inside. What they saw exceeded the worst expectations. A room of about 25 square meters was set up like a prison cell. A bed fixed to the floor, a table, a toilet in the corner. The walls were soundproofed with special material. A small barred window led to a ventilation shaft and provided minimal air access. In the room, there were obvious signs of a person's presence, says police officer Fabian Schneider. A crumpled bed. Food remains on a plate. On the wall, we discovered a scratched name, Anna. The commission immediately called an investigation team. Schubert's apartment was declared a crime scene, a large-scale operation to search for the missing Anna Hoff, and the escaped Gerhard Schubert began. Detective Meyer, who arrived at the crime scene an hour later, organized a thorough examination of the secret room. There were signs of a prolonged stay by a person, he reports. Next to the bed, a stack of books. Some pages contained notes written by a woman's hand. According to the dates, Anna was in this room for at least 10 months. In brief notes that resembled a diary, the girl described her nightmare. Schubert had kidnapped her when she was looking for an apartment to rent. He lured her by allegedly showing her free apartments and then held her by force, regularly sexually abusing her. The worst thing was that other women were also mentioned in the diary, Meyer continues. Anna wrote that before her was Lisa, whom he took somewhere. This made us suspect that Schubert had been acting according to the same pattern for a long time. During the further search of the apartment, the investigators discovered a hiding place under the floor of the storage room. There, personal items of at least 3 women were kept: handbags, jewelry, photos. Among them were documents in the name of Elisabeth Lisa Kraft, who had disappeared in 2017. We also found an external hard drive with photos and videos, says Meyer, without going into details. The content confirmed our worst fears. Schubert documented his crimes over many years. The police issued a national manhunt for Gerhard Schubert. His photos were sent to all police stations in Germany and neighboring countries. The description of his car was forwarded to the traffic police. We were aware that he might have other hiding places, explains Meyer. Vi komment for øyelig kilaya asiso. Selle perioden fortsail fahren. Polici Schubert of an Erika and einen gernevendere ein gonsten processin wie auch die Atapoch. The most terrible thing is that we lived next to this nightmare. She says, I heard her screams, but could do nothing. The system did not work, neither when I called the police nor when Claudia filed a report on suspicion. Claudia Meyer, whose persistence ultimately led to solving the crime, was more categorical. Nobody wanted to see the obvious. Neither the management company, which should have known where the technical room had disappeared, nor the police, who ignored the disappearances. Right under our windows, terrible things were happening, and we acted as if everything was normal. At the end of February 2020, the investigation received a response to the inquiry from the archives of the former East Germany. It turned out that Gerhard Schubert had served a sentence in Dresden prison from 1982 to 1985 for sexual violence against a young woman. After his release, he used a resettlement program to West Germany, changed his documents, and began a new life in München. He had a perfect profile, comments criminal psychologist Helga Wagner, an inconspicuous, lonely man, a job that enabled access to many rooms, a technical education that allowed him to create a soundproof chamber. He methodically hunted women in vulnerable positions. Those who sought cheap apartments had recently moved to the city. Until early March 2020, police had established a connection between Schubert and the disappearance of at least 45 women in the last 15 years. His scheme was simple and effective. He used his knowledge of the real estate market to identify women seeking housing, offered to show an apartment, and then abducted them. We assume that he held each victim for several months up to a year, and then disposed of her to make room for the next one, suspects Meyer grimly. The exact number of victims and their fate remain unknown. Gerhard Schubert himself disappeared without a trace. His car was found abandoned in a parking lot in Salzburg, Austria, 200 kilometers from München. Surveillance cameras showed him leaving the car and boarding a bus that went to Slovenia. After that, the trail was lost. While German police and Interpol continued searching for Schubert, the residents of the building at Lindenstraße 47 tried to return to normal life. Apartment number 17 remained sealed, a silent monument to human cruelty and social indifference. I often think about those sounds behind the wall, says Erika Zimmerman. Someone was trying to reach us, calling for help, and we simply turned up the volume on our televisions louder so as not to hear. Gerhard Schubert's secret room stood empty, but the ghosts of his crimes continued to haunt those who lived nearby and did not notice, or did not want to notice, the tragedy behind the thin wall of an ordinary city apartment. The discovery of the secret room in Gerhard Schubert's apartment transformed the ordinary residential building on Lindenstraße into the epicenter of one of München's most sensational criminal investigations. Police cars, forensic technicians in white overalls, and reporters with cameras filled the quiet courtyard of the 5-story building. Neighbors who had barely noticed each other before now gathered in groups and discussed the shocking news. The area was cordoned off for a week, remembers Erika Zimmerman. Our apartments became part of the crime. The investigators questioned everyone who had ever spoken with Schubert. They searched for every clue about his possible whereabouts. Detective Jürgen Meyer led a special group to capture the fugitive. First, they checked all possible family relationships of the perpetrator. It turned out that Schubert had no close relatives. No brothers, no sisters, no children. His parents had already died in the 1990s. This isolation helped him preserve his secrets for decades. We investigated all his financial transactions, Meyer recounts. He lived frugally, had saved a small sum in his pension account. But 5 days before his escape, he withdrew almost all the money, about 35,000 euros. That's enough to hide for several months if one lives modestly. Of greatest interest to the investigation were the places where Schubert might have hidden the bodies of his victims. A clue emerged during the examination of the retiree's property. It turned out that in 2005 he had acquired a small plot in the Bavarian forest, 180 kilometers from München. According to documents, there was a hunting lodge there. On March 4th, 2020, the investigation team went to this location. A winding forest path led them to a wooden building hidden among trees. The lodge appeared abandoned, dust on the windows, fallen leaves on the veranda. Nothing indicated the recent presence of a human. He obviously didn't come here after his escape, notes Meyer. But we searched the grounds thoroughly anyway. Inside the lodge was spartanly furnished. Minimal furniture, a camping stove, some canned goods in the cupboard, a typical male weekend refuge. Tracking dogs trained to find human remains examined the entire property. Their reaction led the police officers to a shed behind the lodge. When they broke up the wooden floor, they discovered a grave underneath. There were the remains of a woman there, says Mayer. According to the preliminary assessment of the forensic pathologist, death occurred about 3 years ago. We suspected it was Elisabeth Kraft, who had disappeared in 2017. The further investigation of the grounds with ground-penetrating radar revealed 2 more graves. In total, the remains of 3 women were found under the shed floor. All were buried with bound hands, indicating the violent nature of their death. This completely confirmed our theory, the detective continues. Schubert acted according to the same script for many years. He used the city apartment as a prison and then brought the victims to the forest where he disposed of them. The forensic examination confirmed that one of the corpses belonged to Elisabeth Kraft. The other 2 were identified as Sabine Hofer, disappeared in 2015, and Julia Wagner, disappeared in 2012. Anna Hoff was not among those found. If Schubert followed his ritual, why had he not disposed of Anna before he was exposed? Could he be holding her at another location? And most importantly, was she still alive? We proceeded from 2 possibilities, explains Maya. Either he had taken Anna to another location before his escape, or she was still with him. Both scenarios required urgent action. On March 10, 2020, the investigation received the first concrete clue about Schubert's whereabouts. A surveillance camera at a gas station in Maribor, Slovenia, recorded a man who resembled the wanted person. He paid for fuel in cash, wore a cap and sunglasses, but the facial recognition algorithm established a match with 87% probability. That was the first confirmation that he was moving southeast, says Mayer. We immediately contacted the Slovenian police, but by the time we received the information, 2 days had already passed. The trail went cold again. Meanwhile, in the house on Lindenstrasse, the meticulous examination of the perpetrator's apartment continued. The forensic technicians examined literally, millimeter by millimeter, the secret room, searching for clues about Anna Hoff's fate. We found a strange entry in her diary, recounts criminalist Thomas Kraus. The last page contained the sentence, "He says he will take me to the farm soon. It's brighter there, and there's more space." That was the only entry that contained any information about another object. The police checked all agricultural properties within 100 kilometers around München, but none of them were connected to Schubert. He had neither relatives with farms nor friends in rural areas. The entries seemed meaningless. On March 12, 2020, there was an unexpected turn. The police were contacted by Monika Haas, a 68-year-old resident of the small village Großberg, 60 kilometers from München. She claimed to have recognized Schubert from photos in the news. "That's Gerhard, I'm sure," the woman said. "Only we knew him as Gustav Müller. He came to us every few months to help with housework. He said he was a retiree who loves country life." Monika told that Gustav had offered his services himself about 5 years ago. He repaired plumbing, did small repairs, sometimes stayed for a few days. The Haas family owned a small farm with cows and chickens. After her husband's death in 2018, Monika especially appreciated the help of the nice neighbor from the city. She never asked for documents, Maya comments. He helped, she paid cash. Typical informal relationships as they are common in rural areas. On the Haas farm, they discovered a small room in a separate wing where Gustav sometimes spent the night. There was nothing suspicious. A simple bed, a nightstand, some technical magazines. But the tracking dogs showed interest in an old barn that lay 100 meters from the main buildings. The barn was filled with agricultural equipment, recounts Maya. Mrs. Haas said she hadn't entered it for years. After her husband's death, she had reduced the operation, and the need for additional spaces disappeared. When the police officers opened the rusty lock and went inside, they initially noticed nothing unusual. Old rakes, shovels, bags of fertilizer, a tractor that hadn't worked for 10 years. Upon closer examination, however, they discovered a trapdoor in the floor that was cleverly disguised as normal boards. The hatch led to a basement room of 3 by 4 meters. It was similarly equipped as the room in the city apartment: bed, table, elementary amenities. In contrast to the urban cell, however, there were signs of recent human presence here. Fresh food, including bread and milk, that were no more than 2 days old. This was clear proof that Schubert had used this place after his escape, says Meyer, and that most likely Anna Hoff was with him. On the wall we discovered an inscription scratched with a fingernail: "I am here, help me." Experts confirmed that the handwriting matched Anna's diary. Monika Haas was shocked. She swore that she knew nothing about the existence of the basement and had never heard strange sounds. The barn is far from the house, explains Meyer. In rural areas, such buildings often stand apart. Moreover, the basement was well soundproofed. The police monitored the farm, hoping that Schubert would return. But days passed, and he did not appear. It became clear that he had either learned of the discovery of his hiding place or had planned only a temporary stay there from the beginning. On March 20th, 2020, there was new information from Interpol. Schubert was identified on a ferry connection between Split, Croatia and Ancona, Italy. He was traveling under the name Franz Weber with forged documents. Tragically, particularly important, the records showed that he had bought a ticket for one person. This brought us to a dead end, admits Meyer. If Anna was with him in Großberg, where is she now? Did he leave her to die in that basement? Did he dispose of her along the way? Or did he hand her over to someone else? A thorough investigation of the farm and surrounding areas yielded no results. No signs of burial sites or traces of a struggle. It seemed as if Anna had simply vanished. On March 25th, there was a new turn in the investigation. A truck driver named Karl Bauer reported that a week earlier he had given a ride from Großberg to Rosenheim to a man who resembled Schubert. The man was traveling with a young woman who looked sick or drugged. She practically didn't speak, the driver recounted. He explained that his daughter suffered from a mental disorder, and he was taking her to a specialized clinic. I didn't attach any significance to it at the time. Bauer dropped the pair off at Rosenheim bus station. Checking surveillance cameras confirmed his story. At 16:32 on March 16th, a man resembling Schubert and a young woman, presumably Anna Hoff, boarded a bus towards Salzburg. We sent notifications to all hospitals and medical facilities in the region, says Meyer. It was obvious that he was presenting Anna as mentally ill to explain her strange behavior. A clever move. People tend not to interfere in situations involving the mentally ill. However, checking medical facilities yielded no results. No one had reported with a similar story. The investigation was stuck in a dead end again. In early April 2020, the case took an unexpected turn. A call came to the anonymous telephone line of Munich police. A male voice, altered by an electronic device, said, "You are looking in the wrong place. Anna is in Laufen, basement of St. Martin's Church." The police immediately went to the specified location. Laufen is a small town on the border with Austria. St. Martin's Church is an old building from the 13th century in the city center. Beneath it were indeed extensive basement rooms that had previously been used as crypts and in recent years as storage rooms for church items. We involved local police and church authorities, recounts Meyer. We inspected all basement rooms. We found no trace of Anna or anything suspicious. It seemed as if the call was a false signal, an attempt to derail the investigation. But 2 days later, something happened that called this version into question. Church cleaning lady Helga Mittermeier discovered a strange symbol painted on one of the walls while checking the rear rooms of the basement. It was the letter A, surrounded by a circle. Next to it, a barely visible inscription: "Search in the archives." This discovery changed everything. It was clear that someone had been in the church basement and left this message intentionally. Nobody from the church personnel knew about the origin of this inscription. Technical specialists determined that it was completely new, no older than 1 week. Archive could mean anything, from church records to municipal documents. But it seemed most logical that it referred to the church's own archives, which were kept in a separate room in the basement. The archive room contained hundreds of documents dating from the 18th century to the present: church records, financial reports, construction plans. The police officers methodically searched the shelves without knowing exactly what they were looking for. It was like searching for a needle in a haystack, Maya remembers. Until one of the officers noticed a modern folder that clearly stood out from the old folios. The folder contained photocopies of construction plans of the church's basement rooms. On one of the sheets, a small crypt in the back corner of the basement was marked with red pencil. According to the plan, this crypt had been walled up in the 1950s due to its dilapidated condition. When the police officers examined the indicated location, they found that the masonry that sealed the entrance to the crypt had been recently disturbed. Someone had carefully removed several bricks and created an opening large enough for a person to pass through. We carefully widened the passage, Maya recounts. Behind the wall, we discovered a small room about 2 by 3 meters. And there she was, Anna Hoff, alive. The girl was in a severe condition: emaciation, dehydration, several bruises, but she was alive. Next to her lay empty water bottles and packaging from chocolate bars. Schubert had obviously left her minimal supplies that should last for several days. She was too weak to speak, the detective continues. But in her backpack, we found a note. He said he would return in a week if I behaved well. But I don't believe him anymore. Please, find me. Anna was immediately taken to the hospital. After stabilizing her condition, she was able to make initial statements. According to her words, Schubert, after learning about the police investigation, had brought her from the farm to Laufen. He knew this old crypt from historical books, which he was interested in. He told me that this was a temporary hiding place, Maya quotes Anna's statement. That it was now too dangerous to travel together. He promised to prepare a new location and return to me. He said we would go to another country, where we would start a new life. The rescue of Anna Hoff was a victory for the investigation, but the main perpetrator was still at large. Moreover, it now became clear that Schubert was much more inventive and resourceful than originally assumed. When analyzing the perpetrator's actions, the investigators came to the disturbing conclusion that all his movements followed a clear plan. He knew backup hiding places, had forged documents, knew how to avoid surveillance cameras. Possibly he had been preparing escape routes for years. The anonymous call troubled me, Maya admits. At first we thought it was an accomplice of Schubert's who was intentionally leading us on a false trail. But what if it was Schubert himself? What if Anna's rescue was part of his plan? The verification of the call recording yielded no results. The voice was too distorted for identification, but experts noticed that the caller used specific expressions characteristic of the East German dialect. Schubert was born and raised in Dresden. It was a game, psychologist Wagner suspects. He wanted the girl to be found because he knew, while we were busy with Anna's rescue, he had time to establish himself in the new location. Besides, he leaves a trail and demonstrates his intelligence. This is typical for psychopaths of his type. The desire to prove that they are smarter than the system. By the end of April 2020, the investigation already encompassed 5 countries. Interpol was tracking all possible movements of Schubert. His last confirmed location, the ferry to Ancona. After that, he literally disappeared. The Italian police checked all hotels, hostels, and rental apartments in the Ancona area. No matches, neither by name nor by photo. Checking cameras at the train station and bus terminal also yielded no results. He could have used private transportation, Meyer suspects. Perhaps he had accomplices in Italy, or another set of forged documents we know nothing about. In early May, a strange incident occurred. Milan police arrested a man who outwardly resembled Schubert for a petty theft in a supermarket. When checking documents, it turned out to be an Austrian citizen named Wilhelm Kramer, 65 years old. His fingerprints did not match those of the wanted man. Meyer, who received a photo of the arrested man, however, noticed suspicious details. The hairline, the shape of the ears, the distance between the eyes, everything pointed to Schubert, he says. But the documents were flawless. The fingerprints did not match. This seemed impossible. The Italian colleagues released Kramer before the German detectives could fly in for a personal check. He paid a fine and disappeared. A re-examination of his documents revealed that Wilhelm Kramer had actually existed, but died in 2018. Someone was using his identity. We are almost certain it was Schubert, says Meyer. But how did he change his fingerprints? This goes beyond the capabilities of an ordinary person. The answer came unexpectedly. Anna Hoff, who was recovering in the hospital, remembered a strange detail. Schubert often engaged in some manipulations with his hands. He applied a special substance to his fingertips and then sealed them with transparent film. He said that working as a janitor had ruined his fingers. Meyer quotes Anna's words. But once I heard his telephone conversation, he was discussing with someone about applications and their durability. Forensic experts suspected that Schubert used silicone attachments on his fingers, thin, practically invisible films with foreign fingerprints. Such technologies exist, although they are mainly accessible to intelligence services. This explained his confidence during document checks, says Meyer. He knew that his fingerprints would not match the database. But this also meant that he had serious connections. An ordinary domestic violence perpetrator does not have access to such technologies. Meanwhile, police continued investigating the perpetrator's past. Checking his banking transactions over the last 20 years revealed a strange pattern. Every 3 months, he transferred a fixed amount of 500 euros to an account at a Swiss bank. The recipient was the foundation New Horizons. We requested information from our Swiss colleagues, Meyer recounts. It turned out that the foundation officially supports refugees from Eastern Europe, but some of their operations raised questions among financial regulatory authorities. The Swiss police began their own investigation into the foundation's activities. At the end of May, they searched the organization's office in Zurich. Among other things, documents were found proving the provision of new accommodation and identity for a certain GS in southern Italy. The initials matched Schubert's real name. That was a clue, says Meyer. But the documents did not specify a concrete location, only the general direction, Calabria, a region in southern Italy. Calabria is a large area with hundreds of small towns and villages. Finding a person there who might have changed his appearance seemed practically impossible. But the investigation received unexpected help. In early June, a letter without sender reached the Munich police. It contained a worn postcard with a view of a small coastal town. On the back was written, "He is here, Tropea, Vineyards." No signature. Tropea is a picturesque town on the coast of the Tyrrhenian Sea, a popular tourist destination. Around it were indeed extensive vineyards belonging to various private enterprises. We immediately contacted the Italian colleagues, says Meyer. They began a discreet check of all vineyard workers within 20 kilometers of Tropea. Many enterprises hire seasonal workers without official registration, often foreigners. The investigation lasted several weeks. The Italian police questioned vineyard owners and showed them photos of Schubert, but without success. nobody recognized the man in the picture. In mid-June, there was a new turn. A local woman, Maria Rossi, contacted the police in Torpea. She reported that her neighbor, a recently arrived German named Walter, was behaving strangely. He avoided neighbors, never invited anyone to his home, and particularly suspicious, a generator constantly ran in his backyard, although there were no problems with power supply in the city. The Italian police officers monitored the house, Maya recounts. It was a small villa on the outskirts of town, partially hidden by olive trees. Walter indeed led a secluded life. He only went out shopping, always with a cap and sunglasses, even in cloudy weather. After a week of observation, the police obtained a search warrant for a covert inspection of the house in the owner's absence. When Walter drove to town for shopping, 2 officers broke into the villa. What they discovered left no doubt, says Maya. In the basement of the house was a room under construction, with a reinforced door, soundproofing, no windows. It was not completed, but obviously intended for housing prisoners. Next to it, in a box, lay women's wigs of various colors and shapes. The police prepared for an arrest, but final confirmation of identity was required. The fingerprints in the house had been carefully eliminated. All surfaces were regularly wiped. Even on the trash, there were no traces. The decisive evidence was a worn book found in the bedroom, an engineering handbook in German. On the flyleaf was a barely recognizable inscription: to Gerhard from colleagues, 1998. This was the first concrete connection between Walter and the saw perpetrator. The Italian police decided to act. On June 25th, 2020, when Walter returned home, a special unit surrounded the villa. Through a loudspeaker, he was offered to surrender. Instead, shots came from the house. A siege began that lasted almost 5 hours. Walter refused to negotiate and occasionally shot in the direction of the police officers. With nightfall, the Special Operations Command decided to storm. During the attempt to break in, Walter opened fire and wounded one of the officers. Through return fire, he was severely injured. The medics who arrived at the scene determined a critical condition: gunshot wounds to chest and neck. The injured man was brought to the hospital in Tropea, Maya recounts. Although he was unconscious, police took fingerprints and sent them to the international database. The results were supposed to arrive within an hour. But the resolution came earlier. The doctor who examined the patient noticed something strange. On the injured man's neck was a thin seam visible that ran along the hairline. It looked like the trace of a recent plastic surgery. Further examination also revealed other traces of surgical interventions. On the hands, ears, even on the fingertips. Walter had changed his appearance as radically as possible without attracting attention. When the results of the fingerprint check arrived, we received confirmation, says Maya. It was indeed Gerhard Schubert, despite all the changes in appearance Chaxi find. The criminal was arrested directly in the hospital room, under round-the-clock guard. His condition remained critical. Doctors estimated his survival chances as minimal. Meanwhile, the search of the villa continued. In a hiding place under the floorboards, they found documents in various names, a large sum of cash, maps of several European cities with markings. Among the papers, they also found a photocopy of a newspaper article about Anna Hoff's rescue with sections underlined in red. He followed the investigation, Maya comments. Perhaps he was even proud that he made us search for so long. For such people, it is a kind of game, a confirmation of their own superiority. But the most disturbing find awaited the investigators on Schubert's computer. In an encrypted folder, dossiers on several young women living in Tropea and surrounding areas were kept, Photos taken with hidden cameras, addresses, daily routines. He had already selected the next victim. "We came literally a few weeks too late," says Maya. "The room in the basement was almost finished. Soon he would have begun hunting again." On June 28th, 2020, 3 days after the arrest, doctors reported an improvement in Schubert's condition. He regained consciousness and could speak. The investigators hoped to finally get answers to many questions. But fate decided otherwise. On the morning of June 29th, the duty nurse found Schubert dead in his room. The preliminary findings indicated cardiac arrest, but the examination revealed traces of an unknown substance in his blood. "We suspect that he somehow gained access to poison," says Maya. "Either he had a capsule hidden in his body, or someone passed the substance to him." The investigation of this aspect continues. Schubert's death left many questions unanswered. Who helped him all these years? Who provided the technology for changing fingerprints? Was he connected to criminal organizations? Tragically, and most importantly, how many women became his victims in total over decades? "We continue our work," explains Maya. "The perpetrator's death does not mean closing the case. We must find all his victims so their families can at least get some closure to this tragedy." While investigators examine the material from the villa in Tropea, Anna Hoff gradually returns to normal life. Physical wounds heal faster than psychological ones, but with the support of specialists and her family, she makes progress. "I still wake up at night from nightmares," she shared in an interview. "But now, I know he will never come again to take me. That helps me move forward." The house at Lindenstraße 47 gradually returns to normal life. Schubert's apartment remains sealed until the investigation concludes. Many neighbors still cannot believe they lived next to a monster and noticed no obvious signs. "The worst thing is," says Erika Zimmerman, "that there could be dozens of such Schuberts. They live among us, greet in the stairwell, discuss the weather. And behind their doors, hell is hidden. And we simply don't want to see it." The death of Gerhard Schubert in the hospital of Tropea brought the investigation to its final phase. Now that the main perpetrator no longer posed a threat, investigators focused on reconstructing a complete picture of his crimes and finding all his victims. "To answer the main question, how many women suffered at his hands in all these years?" says Detective Jürgen Meyer. For the families of the missing, this was the last chance to learn the truth. During the investigation, a simple notebook was found in Schubert's villa in Tropea, hidden under a floorboard in the bedroom. In it, the perpetrator kept records of his victims. Names, dates, sometimes brief comments. In total, 8 women were on the list, including Anna Hoff. The notebook covered the period from 2010 to 2020, explains Maya. "We suspect that earlier records might exist in another location or were destroyed. The verification of unsolved missing person cases in the München area revealed matches with 5 names from the list. The comparison of dates also confirmed the connection. The women disappeared exactly on the days that Schubert noted in his records. There remained the question of the locations where the victims were buried. In the notebook were found cryptic notes F, W, B, next to some names. The investigators suspected these could be places where Schubert disposed of the bodies. We deciphered these notes quite quickly, tells Meyer. F meant field, W, forest, B, mountain. He simply marked the type of terrain where he had hidden the body. In August 2020, search groups with dogs began examining the area around Schubert's hunting cabin in the US, the Bavarian forest. Within a radius of 2 kilometers from the building, the remains of 3 women were found: Elisabeth Kraft, Sabine Hofer, and Julia Wagner. He didn't make much effort to hide the bodies. says forensic pathologist Thomas Kraus. Shallow graves, minimal effort. Typical for perpetrators of this type, after the victim stops being of interest to them, they simply want to get rid of it as quickly as possible. The continuation of the search in mountainous terrain near Salzburg, where Schubert sometimes spent, Gens, led to the discovery of 2 more graves. The remains belonged to Martha Weiss and Helga Schulz, who had disappeared in 2008 and 2013. The total number of confirmed victims reached 7, summarizes Meyer. Given the evidence we have, these are probably most, if not all, the women who became victims of Schubert. Although there can be no complete certainty. Of particular interest were the perpetrator's motives. What caused an outwardly normal retiree to kidnap and kill women over so many years? During the search of the apartment on Lindenstrasse, we discovered a hiding place with pornographic material, says Meyer, with sadistic content focusing on dominance and control. Some magazines dated from the 1970s. This indicates that his deviant inclinations arose already in his youth. Psychologist Helga Wagner, who examined the case materials, concluded that Schubert suffered from sexual psychopathy enhanced by narcissistic personality disorder. He enjoyed not only the physical control over the victims, but also the emotional power, she explains. In his records, we find notes about the women's reactions to captivity, about how their behavior changed over time. It was a form of cruel experiment. A deeper investigation of Schubert's biography brought several disturbing episodes to light. In 1982, still in East Germany, he was arrested for an attack on a young woman. However, the case did not go to court. The victim suddenly withdrew her statement and then even left the city. This was the first episode of violence known to us, says Meyer. After that, there is a gap of several years in Schubert's biography. We suspect he might have served a sentence, although there is no documentary confirmation of this. In München, he began a new life without the shadow of the past. Nobody knew his criminal history. He was the perfect neighbor, colleague, employee, comments Meyer. Quiet, helpful, never caused problems. This is a typical pattern for such perpetrators. Their ordinary life is a carefully constructed facade. It turned out that he specifically sought exactly this position, although with his technical education, he could have claimed better paid work. The position of janitor gave him unique opportunities, explains Meyer. Access to all rooms of the building, the ability to enter residents' apartments under the pretext of repairs, information about who lives alone, who is often absent. For a predator, these are ideal conditions. His scheme of action was simple and effective. Schubert selected women who had recently moved to the area, often those who were looking for an apartment. As a janitor, he offered to show vacant apartments at a special price. This is how he lured victims to remote locations. On his computer, we found fake apartment advertisements, says Meyer. He placed them on local bulletin boards and listed enticingly low prices. This attracted exactly those who were financially constrained. Female students, young professionals, single women with low incomes. Anna Hoff, the only surviving victim, told how she fell into the trap. I was looking for a cheap apartment and came across an advertisement. Meyer quotes her statement. I called the given number. A man introduced himself as the janitor. He said that the apartment would officially be advertised only in a week, but he could show it to me right now if I was interested. It looked like a lucky chance. At the meeting, Schubert behaved professionally and politely. He showed Anna several apartments in the building, one of which was indeed vacant and would soon be rented. This calmed the girl's vigilance. Then he said there was another apartment with a better layout. Meyer continues summarizing the statement. He led her to his apartment, offered tea. Anna drank and soon felt dizzy. She woke up already in the secret room. A thorough analysis of the drinks and medications found in Schubert's apartment revealed that he used strong sedatives to immobilize the victims. He obtained prescriptions for these preparations with forged documents at various clinics in München. Tragically, that required no special connections or knowledge, explains pharmacist Klaus Hoffmann, who advised the investigation. Unfortunately, the prescription system in Germany is still vulnerable to such manipulations, especially when the person raises no suspicion and visits different clinics. The story of Schubert's escape and his movements through Europe gradually became clearer. It turned out that he had been preparing for such a scenario for a long time. On his computer, they found a folder named Emergency that contained information about routes, safe places, and contacts. He was methodical in everything. He probably understood that he would be discovered sooner or later and prepared a retreat plan in advance. A mystery remained the identity of Walter Krauss, under which Schubert hid in Italy. Verification of the documents showed that they were of high quality, not homemade forgeries, but professionally manufactured fakes.
We suspect that he acquired them through criminal connections,
explains Meyer. On the internet, there are shadow markets where with sufficient means one can buy practically any document. Schubert had apparently been setting aside money for such a situation for years. The villa in Tropea was also acquired through a complex scheme. Formerly, it belonged to a company registered in Cyprus that rented the property long-term to Walter Krause. This complicated tracing the actual owner. He used typical methods of money laundering and concealment of assets, says financial crime specialist Andrea Rossi. One doesn't need to be a genius to organize such a scheme. It's enough to find the right lawyer who's willing to overlook certain details for an additional fee. Schubert's death in the hospital in Tropea was initially classified as suicide. Toxicological analysis detected barbiturates in his blood, a strong sleeping medication that in high doses can cause respiratory arrest. How he had obtained the preparation remained a mystery, says Meyer. The version that a poison capsule was hidden in his body seemed incredible. More likely is that someone handed him the substance. The review of the hospital's surveillance camera recordings revealed that Schubert was visited a day before his death by a nurse who did not work on that ward. She spent about 5 minutes in the room, supposedly to check the IV drip. The Italian police identified her as Maria Bianchi, an employee from another wing of the hospital. During questioning, Maria admitted that she had handed tablets to the patient at his request, Meyer recounts. He told her that he had severe pain and the prescribed painkillers were not helping. She pitied the old man and brought him a strong sleeping medication from her department. Maria suspected nothing of the patient's true identity and his intention to commit suicide. She was charged with negligence resulting in death, but given the circumstances, the court limited itself to a suspended sentence and revocation of her medical license. Schubert chose death over trial and life imprisonment, comments psychologist Wagner. For a person with his personality type, loss of control, public exposure and imprisonment would have been unbearable. Suicide, the last act of control over his own fate. In December 2020, the investigation approached completion. All found remains were identified and handed over to families for burial. Anna Hoff began a new life under a different name in another country after a long rehabilitation. One last important question remained for the investigation, says Meyer. Had Schubert acted alone all those years? A thorough check of all his contacts revealed no accomplices. Schubert was a classic loner who avoided close relationships. His crimes were a purely personal matter that he shared with no one. Such people usually do not form teams, explains Wagner. Their motivation is too egocentric. They do not want to share their power over victims with someone else. In January 2021, the case was officially closed. Schubert's apartment at Lindenstraße 47 remained sealed for several more months, while its further fate was decided. Finally, the management company decided on a complete redesign of the space to eliminate all traces of the past. The house itself gradually returned to normal life. New residents moved into vacated apartments without suspecting the horrors that had taken place behind the walls of the neighboring apartment. People met in the elevator, nodded to each other, and hurried on to their affairs. The story of Gerhard Schubert is a reminder that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facade. Meyer concludes. Behind the doors of a typical city apartment in a quiet residential district, a man whom neighbors considered a harmless retiree created a true hell for his victims. In March 2021, as public attention for the case Verschuldtin began to wane, an unexpected event occurred. A man who introduced himself as Thomas Fischer contacted the Munich police. He stated that he had met Schubert a few years ago through an internet forum that dealt with dominance and control. He claimed that Schubert tried to involve him in his activities, recounts Meyer. Showed photos of women he called his students. Thomas thought at the time it was some kind of voluntary BDSM relationships and broke off contact when he sensed this was too extreme for him. The police carefully verified Fischer's information. His story was confirmed by preserved correspondence in which Schubert, under a pseudonym, indeed discussed his hobbies and sought like-minded individuals. This made us think about the possible existence of other similar perpetrators, says Meyer. The forums where Schubert frequented could serve as a place to search not only for victims, but also for followers. Together with the cybercrime department, the police began monitoring the resources mentioned by Fischer. The results were disturbing. In closed sections of the forums, topics were regularly discussed that went far beyond the framework of legal consensual BDSM practices. Some users were openly interested in methods of restraining and controlling non-consenting partners. We cannot say how many of these conversations are just fantasies and how many are plans for real crimes, Meyer admits. But the fact remains, such communities exist and they can serve as breeding grounds for new Schuberts. At the end of March 2021, the long-awaited renovation of the basement rooms began in the building. At Lindenstraße 47. The management company decided to modernize the old water and heating systems, while simultaneously checking all technical areas for possible illegal modifications. We want to ensure that such a situation never repeats itself, explained Administrator Dieter Kraus at a residents' meeting. Every room will be carefully inspected and brought into compliance with modern security requirements. The residents welcomed this initiative. Nobody wanted to live in a house with a sinister reputation. Nobody wanted to walk past the apartment every day where a terrible tragedy had taken place. On April 15, 2021, apartment number 17, formerly Schubert's property, was offered for sale after complete reconstruction and renovation. Information about the room's past was mandatorily indicated in the documents according to German law. This significantly lowered the apartment's market value, but ensured transaction transparency. Surprisingly, we quickly found a buyer, recounts real estate agent Claudia Meyer, an older man who had recently moved from Hamburg to Munich. He was not deterred by the apartment's history. Said, he didn't believe in ghosts and was willing to overlook the past at this price. The new owner of apartment number 17 became Walter Fischer, a 65-year-old retiree, former technical specialist. A quiet, polite man who preferred solitude. The neighbors rarely saw him, mainly early in the morning when he fetched fresh newspaper. None of the residents noticed his habit of observing young passing women for long periods. And nobody connected his name, Beiter Fischer, with that Thomas Fischer who had contacted the police a few weeks earlier with information about Schubert. At the end of April 2021, a new resident appeared in the building, 24-year-old Sophie Bauer, a student who had rented a small apartment on the second floor, a young, attractive girl who had just moved from a small town to Munich and knew nobody in the big city. Life at Lindenstrasse 47 continued its usual course. People hurried to their business, greeted each other during encounters and hurried on without asking questions about neighbors, without being interested in what was happening behind the closed doors of other apartments. Nobody noticed how Walter Fischer helped Sophie carry heavy bags to her apartment. And nobody heard how he suggested stopping by for a cup of tea to discuss peculiarities of life in this house that newcomers should know.